Okay, so we're going to continue on with our DOM test environment, and we're going to create a function that will check a DOM tree for duplicate IDs. Okay, so basically if we have, let's say we have a div as our root, and then inside that there's another div with an ID of hello, and then there's another div or even paragraph or anything with an ID of hello. If that's the case, then we want this to return true. If not, we want it to return false. So let's create our folder. We're going to call this Has Duplicate IDs. And inside that, we're going to have our Has Duplicate IDs.js and also Has Duplicate IDs.test.js. All right, so I'm going to start off writing some of the tests, and then we'll jump in and create the function. So let's first bring in, the function is going to be called Has Duplicate. It's going to be camel case, so Has Duplicate IDs, and that's going to be from, let's say, require from /has duplicate IDs. So as far as our tests, let's say describe, and we'll say DOM tree has duplicate IDs, duplicate. Then we'll have our function. Okay, and then I'm just going to do a couple simple tests. So let's say it, and let's just make sure that it's a function. So we'll say should be a function. And then we just want to expect the type of Has duplicate IDs, and that should equal function. Okay, the type should equal function. We also want to make sure it returns a Boolean. So we'll say should return a Boolean. So we just want to test the type of, and we want the return value, so we're actually going to add our parentheses here, and we want that to equal a Boolean. Okay, and then let's copy that down, and we want it to return false if there's no root element passed in. Let's change this. Should return false if no root. Now we want to just get rid of type of and just run Has Duplicate IDs and not pass in anything, and that should be false. Now we can do to equal false, or we can say to be falsy. And then this one is one of the main tests that we want, and this will return true if there are duplicate IDs. Okay, so let's bring that down, and we'll say it should return true if there are duplicate IDs. So we'll just get rid of that, and let's say expect, I'm sorry, we don't need to do expect yet, because we actually need to create some mock elements to test. So let's say create mock elements. And we're going to do similar to what we did in the last video. We're going to create a root and set that to document.create element. We're going to create a div. And then let's create some child elements. So we'll say const child1, and then document.create element, and we're going to create another div. They don't have to be divs, but I'm just going to make them. And then child2 is also going to be a div. Now we want to append to the root. So let's say root.append child, and we're going to append child1. We also want to append child2. And let's see, we're going to then add our IDs. So we'll come down here and we'll say root, let's just put a comment here. So add duplicate IDs. Now, even if root has an ID that's duplicate, we want that to return true as well. I mean, technically you shouldn't have duplicate IDs on a page. Classes, obviously you can have the same class name, but you should not have duplicate IDs. That's not what they're really meant for. So let's say root ID, we'll set that ID to root, but then for the children, let's say child1.id, we're going to set to child, and then I want to create a duplicate ID by setting child2 ID to child as well. All right, then we'll have our result. So let's say const result. We're going to call our function, so has duplicate IDs. We're going to pass in the root. Okay, and then we want to expect that to be true because we do have duplicate IDs. So we'll say expect the result to equal, we want it to equal true. All right, and we'll write some other tests, but for now, let's just go with this. So let's jump into our has duplicate IDs.js, and we're going to create our function. So has duplicate IDs. Now this is going to take in a root, and then what we're going to do is store our IDs in a set. So we're going to say ID set, and I'm going to initialize that to a new set. Okay, and we went over the set data structure a little while ago. It's basically just a set of unique values. So the first thing we'll do is make sure that there is a root being passed in. If not, then we'll return false. That's actually one of our tests. So let's say if not root, then we'll return false. Okay, now if the root has an ID and the ID set already has that ID, then of course we want to return true. That's a duplicate ID. So let's do that. We'll say if the ID set, now on sets you have a has method, so you can check to see if a certain value is in there, and we're going to pass in the root ID. Okay, so if it has that, then we want to return true. So that will check the root ID and compare it to the set. Now, if the root has an ID, we want to add it to the set. So let's say root.id, and I'm going to use the double ampersand here because we're saying if there's a root ID, then let's say ID set.add, and we want to add that root.id. Okay, now we want to do the child nodes. So if that root has child nodes, okay, which is a method. So if it has child nodes, then we're going to loop through each child. So in our test, that would be these two, right? Because we appended child 1 and child 2 to the root. So it's going to loop through. We'll say let child of root.children, which is a property of all the children. And then what we're going to do is basically run this has duplicate IDs recursively for each child, where the child will be passed in as the root, because again, we want to just check to see if the set has that ID. So let's say const result, and we'll say has duplicate IDs, and we're going to pass in child as the root, and then we want to pass in the ID set, okay, which at this point has the whatever the root ID is inside of it. Okay, then if we want to say if result, then we want to return true, because that means that there's a duplicate. Now outside of this if statement here, we just want to return false, because if nothing has been returned yet, then that means there's no duplicates, so we want to return false. And of course we have to export. Oops, we don't want to do that. All right, so let's run npm run test, and it passed. Now, I also want to test for if I want it to return false if there are not duplicate IDs, which is going to be very similar to this. So to start off here, what I'm going to do is just copy this whole test right here. So we're going to grab that and then under it, we'll paste it in, and we're going to say should return false if there are no duplicate IDs. Now this part is going to be the same. We're going to create our mock elements, and then we're going to add, let's say, just add IDs, because now we don't want them to be duplicates. So we'll have a class of child 1 and an ID of child 1 and child 2. Then we want to run the root through has duplicate IDs, and the result should be false. So we'll say to equal false. You could also use to be falsy. All right, so I think that's all we have to do for that. All right, so npm run test. Okay, so everything passed. So we have 29 tests total that have passed. Now, I just want to show you that we repeated ourselves quite a bit here, because we had to create these mock elements, and then we had to append the child. We did that in both tests, and you might have other tests where you do the same thing. So to reduce, to make our code dry, don't repeat yourself, we can actually run certain things before each test and after each test. And we can do that by using what are called hooks. So there's a hook called before each, and what I want to do is create our mock elements before each test, so we don't have to do it, separately in each one. So to do this, we're going to go up to the top of describe, and I'm just going to initialize root here. So we'll say let root, and then what we can do is say before each, and that's going to take in a function. Okay, and then whatever I put in here, we can run before each test. And what I want to do is, first of all, let's see, we want to do this. Actually, we just want to do all of this. We want to create the elements, the root and the children, and then we want to append the children. So let's just, I'll take the comment too. So we'll go ahead and cut that and put that in our before each. Now I initialize the root variable here, so we just want to get rid of this. And let's see, so we have our root, then we're adding the child divs to the root. Now there's also an after each, so right after before each, we'll say after each, and we just pass in a function. And what I want to do here is set root to null. Okay, so we're basically going to reset it after each test. Now if we go down here, so this is the first test, we already cut what we needed to out of this, so this one here, we already have this, is going to run before each test, so we don't need it here. Now the issue we have now is child 1 and child 2 in both of these tests is not going to exist because we defined it in the before each. So what we can do, since we're adding those children to the root, we can access them through the children property. So instead of putting child 1 here, we can say root dot children, and we're going to get the first child and then test that ID, or I'm sorry, assign that ID. And then here we'll do the same thing. So we'll say root dot children, and that's going to be the index of 1. That's going to be the second ID, and that's being set to child. Okay, and then we'll just do the same thing here. Just want to change this one to a 1. Okay, because again, we don't have access to child 1 and child 2, so we're just using the children property. So let's save that, and I'll also just do a console log just so you can see that these do run. So let's say console log, and we'll say before, yeah, well, I guess we'll just say before each ran. And then in here, we'll say console log after each ran. So now let's run our test. Okay, so if we come up here, you can see the console logs. So for all the tests, It's going to do those console logs, and we passed, so still got 29 passed. So we were able to put this stuff here so that we don't have to put it in the test itself. Because, if you have, imagine you have 10, 20 different tests where you're doing kind of the same stuff, especially if you're using jsdom, you're going to be doing a lot of mock elements. So it's really helpful to have this hook where we can just do it all here instead of repeating ourselves. All right, so hopefully this section gave you guys a good idea of how testing works, as well as just kind of sharpening your JavaScript skills with the algorithms that we did.